Okay.
Got
Um,
it.
so I did do a little outline as I had promised, and
Oh,
I'm
nice.
just going to engage you along the outline. I don't know if I need to tell you or if you're even
Yeah, no, this is
to.
way better. I'll go along for
Okay.
the ride.
Okay, cool. So, one of the things that I noticed when we start talking, like there's never a defined like, okay, we've started talking. So I want to do that a little bit more intentionally this time.
Sure.
So today we're talking about conspiracy theories.
It's a
And
good one.
yeah, you went through a week where you were just talking about aliens for a while, and I loved all those videos, and so I wanted to talk to you about conspiracy theories because I think um, there's so much interesting perspective, and it's a way of getting to know someone too.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of one of these weird sort of wedges you can use to sort of siphon out your audience, you know. And I find like now if I get together with old groups of friends, we sort of like trade notes on who's like gone sort of into the rabbit hole, and that never used to be the case, right? Like that was not even an idea that would happen. Like
Yeah,
I
like
had friends who,
who from our friends has fallen off from reality?
yeah, totally. Like I had friends who definitely went into like the health food world, but that was just like they just thought like I don't want to eat McDonald's because I'll die, which is actually a reasonable thing, right?
Yeah,
But it was never like I want to eat oats, but also I believe that the FDA is conspiring with Pfizer to poison our water supply or something, right? Like that
right.
would be a little like, that's an eyebrow raiser, you know. So I feel like things have definitely accelerated for better or worse. Probably worse in my opinion, but yeah.
How would you define a conspiracy theory?
Oh, that's a hard question. That's a great question, though. That's like asking a right winger, how do you define woke? You know?
Yeah, I was so surprised to hear that there is no definition for woke because I certainly can't define it. I know what it means.
Yeah, it's like basically anything vaguely leftist that involves paying attention to one's own speech. I guess that would be my rough hand definition of
Hmm.
woke. But yeah, conspiracy to me, a conspiracy. Okay, I guess colloquially speaking, a conspiracy theory to me is the idea that there is a person or a small group of people with insider knowledge who maintain very um, concerted control over various aspects of our lives, and that they are hidden and are not known by the wider public, and they are behind covering up or propagating certain things that run completely counter to conventional knowledge. That's just totally pulled out of my rear end at this point. But
Okay.
that if I'm thinking about it, that's the definition I would put on the table.
Okay,
Right?
so I looked this up on the web
Okay.
and you got so close to that definition. You're
Ah.
like clearly a writer. So, it is defined by the web as a belief that some secret but influential organization is responsible for an event or phenomenon.
Yeah, that's much simpler. That's much more parsimonious. I like that one better.
Yes.
But I
Um,
also wonder if it's a belief, right? Because I think this is the thing we need to acknowledge off the bat. And this is the thing that people always jump down my throat whenever I talk about this stuff. Is like, but some conspiracies are real. So I think that is absolutely fair. Like, there are absolutely real conspiracies. Um, but in my view, they're like really penny ante in the grand scheme of things, meaning like there was a conspiracy here in Canada among grocery companies to fix the price of bread. That is a real thing that actually happened. Um, there are things that are like pseudo conspiratorial, but not really, between like big, you know, chemical companies, for example, who work in concert with lobbyists, but they would never say that in public, right? You could say that like big tobacco's long-standing um, court battle to sort of fight against the restriction against tobacco products under the false pretense that it was healthy for you or non-harmful for you. That was obviously a kind of conspiracy, right? So I don't want to say that there's no real conspiracy theories or that all conspiracy theories are false. I just think like the kind of conspiracy theory that would require a multitude of international conglomerates to work together to, I think those are the ones I have trouble believing or just flat out don't believe.
I think conspiracy theories require belief in something that has uh no way of being proven or disproven, and
Right.
that's usually where they start. So uh I've followed a few conspiracy theories on like podcasts that I've listened to, and they always have the quality of like there is a very reasonable thing that they start with, and then every bit along the way down the rabbit hole of the conspiracy is confirming what has happened in the real world through some crazy, windy uh, reasoning. And those lines of reasoning require a lot of belief, require a lot of like, well, I believe that this is happening. And so the difference between conspiracy and conspiracy theory is like that belief piece. Um, we have all kinds of beliefs that we operate on that a lot of us like agree on. I would say the idea that capitalism is bad for people is probably a belief system. There's not really a way to test that. It's just we kind of have a feeling that that's what's going on.
Right.
Um, and so there's like a lot of under that litmus test, there's a lot of things that you could categorize as conspiracy theories. It's interesting. There are also certain conspiracy theories that I believe in and some that I don't. And I was like, what is the difference between those things? And
So
I
what's
think,
one that you believe in? I'm
okay,
curious.
I'm gonna list a few conspiracy theories out that are like very popular. And there's one
Okay.
that I found that I was like, oh my God, we gotta talk about this. I had no idea about it. So like for example, the conspiracy theory of QAnon.
Okay.
Um, and what I believe QAnon to be, or what I had heard QAnon was, is like someone high up in the government has like ultra amazing clearance and has access to all these documents. And it's basically like, oh, Trump isn't an idiot. Trump is like trying to save America.
Right.
Um, and like none of the QAnon stuff like works for me. Like that's not one that I believe in. I think most people I know have been like, what's going on with this QAnon stuff?
Yeah.
Um, so QAnon's one I don't think either of us believe in.
Correct.
Um,
I think that's been thoroughly debunked as well, right? Like they know the guy who is almost certainly behind
yeah,
those posts. Yeah.
yes. And just like basically anybody that comes out on the internet and says like I'm this big deal person and I know all this stuff, I'm like, wait a second. Anybody who needs to come out on the internet and say they're a big deal, they're not a big deal. It's kind of like people who are actually rich don't buy big fancy cars because they don't need to prove to anybody that they're rich. The people who
Right.
buy big fancy cars are people who are like barely rich, who need
Right.
to show off their whatever. So I was like, oh, that doesn't seem real to me because anybody who had that clearance would be like not flaunting it. Um, what do you think about flat Earth stuff?
Well, I mean that's equally silly, right? Like there's to me the thing with flat earth is if you actually a lot of conspiracy theories to me are like proving they try to point out how it's covered up or why it would be covered up, but they never actually try to prove the positive, right? So they what they don't do is they don't look at empirical evidence to say this is the objective observable fact of the world and this is why we believe that the model of a flat earth matches it more accurately than a global earth or whatever. But the thing is they can't do that because the knots that you immediately tie yourself into once you try to prove the positive of flat earth or just immediately destroy your argument, right? And there's a great documentary they did, I think, can't remember what it's called, on the whole flat earther movement, and it ends with this incredible and very well designed empirical experiment to prove that the Earth is flat, and then they end up inadvertently proving that in fact the Earth is curved, right? So I think that one is like bears no interest for me whatsoever in terms of like the actual substance of it. But what I do find interesting is like, and what's not actually not even it's actually very rarely talked about is like how the link between the flat Earth conspiracy theory and like the fundamentalist Christian worldview, right? And that's very hush hush because a lot of flat earthers wouldn't immediately identify themselves as fundamentalist Christians. But if you dive deep enough into that rabbit hole, you see that a lot of the people propagating this, oh surprise, believe that God created the heaven and the earth in 7 days and the firmament and all this sort of thing, right? And so that at least makes more sense to me culturally speaking.
Flat Earth is one of those ones that's so clearly showing the aspect of conspiracy theories where it requires an inherent belief in the thing and
Yeah.
not a lot of investigation. Usually, with conspiracy theories, they're non falsifiable. This one is
Yeah.
very falsifiable.
It's like patently
Very.
so. Yeah.
Yes. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
so fascinating that it could exist. Uh, so there's that one. You talked a lot about aliens and UFOs.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we want to say like UFOs are like a whole group. Like, what do you think about aliens?
So it's interesting because as you were talking about the least plausible conspiracy theories, it's like, oh, she's going to talk about aliens, and then I'm going to have to get a little murkier because, like, just in the last 2 weeks, maybe it was like 3 weeks, I can't remember who it was, but some legitimately high up former American and agency person basically came out and said, yeah, we've recovered material from crashed UFOs, and we're analyzing them in government. And this is like, it would be one thing if like there's a very famous figure in UFO circles, Bob Lazar or whatever, and he's like said, oh, I used to be a physicist, and then people have looked into his history and found out that he completely over exaggerated his role. And there's a lot of people like that, right? Like there's a former Canadian cabinet minister who came out in his very very old age to say that aliens exist. I've seen the government prove. But these aren't people that these are people who you could legitimately see as having a lot to gain by making up stories, right? Whereas this person was high up enough that you had to at least stroke your chin a little bit to be like, well, what's going on here? You know what I mean? But I still, the thing is, I'm willing to say I don't know with regard to you know uh, the level of knowledge of our governments about the existence of aliens in space or whatever. Um, but again, if you actually think about this clearly, um, you'd have to think, well, how many agencies would have to know about this, and how many people would have to be sworn to secrecy to cover this up for it to be like legitimately plausible. And that's when it gets a little trickier. So that one is still like that one. I'm much more agnostic on saying yay or nay against. Like I'm a reasonable person when it comes to these things. Like I don't want to slam the door shut on that sort of thing. But that's where it gets murkier. That's where it's a little less clear that you can believably falsify that kind of thing.
I so I totally believe that there are aliens and
Okay,
UFOs.
so that's the green light.
I'm not a great source on this because I have always believed no matter how much evidence came out. So you could say that my green light on this is based more in my belief system.
Right.
I know all the Bob Lazar stuff. I listen to every Joe Rogan podcast where he interviews UFO people, both credible ones and not credible ones.
Yeah.
And there have been a lot of different government officials, military men, highly respected people with logical minds who have no reason to make this up. And I thought during the pandemic, the government, like the US government, released something where, like, yeah, UFOs exist. We have no idea what's going on. And I remember it coming across my For You page where they were like, so much has happened in 2020 that the government just plainly said UFOs exist and nobody noticed.
Yeah, like I think they're definitely seeing something up there. And I think they legitimately, in some cases, don't know what it is at all. And I think that there's definitely an internecine battle between various agencies on how much they're willing to like reveal about this. And I think this is where it gets murky, right? Because um, I think it was Leslie Kean who's done a few stories for the New York Times on the fact that the government was aware, like the famous I can't remember, flick videos of the fighter jets seeing things, and it accounts from totally sober-minded pilots who legitimately say we saw this incredibly bizarre and physically impossible aerial phenomenon out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean or whatever. So those are things that you can't just dismiss completely out of hand, right? And so I think there is a gray area there between something like asserting that it's very possible, if not even likely, that the government is in some way or form covering up something about the existence of aliens. It's like you can say that, but then going from there to say like the aliens have infiltrated our government and we have like a
Hmm.
secret proxy alien. You know what I mean? But this is like the line between what we know empirically and can report in a major national newspaper, between what we're literally just making up for the sake of like making things a little more interesting, and I think that's where I have a lot of sympathy with people who question, the official story on what's going on, and then yeah. Anyway, because yeah, I don't know why I find UFOs fascinating. I think because I saw one. I saw one when I was in my
Hmm.
early 20s, and I love my UFO story because it's so innocuous, but it's also one that a lot of people have shared with me that they've seen the same thing. And I remember I was at a party. This was probably the early 2000s in Toronto. I was visiting because I was going to University of Montreal and I was visiting friends in Toronto. I was at a rooftop party, and it was just this beautiful night, and we were just having drinks on the roof, and then a friend of mine, one of my oldest friends, and I saw this light, and it was like not a satellite, it was not an airplane, it was a very clear light, it wasn't a laser, and it was moving across the sky in this very direct, sort of triangular, angular way, and it would move, it would slow down, it would stop, then it would move again and slow down and stop. And can I 100% say with certainty that this wasn't some sort of weird projection from the city? No. But knowing what I know about those things, I strongly believe that wasn't the case. So I remember I saw this thing. It's like, that's really weird. And it's really weird that we're both seeing this and we're just going back to our party and having drinks. You know what I mean? And I think a lot of people have had experiences like this where they see something that they know doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but they don't panic about it. They don't need to go to Reddit to post about it. They just sort of put it in the memory banks and then sort of go on with their lives. So for that reason, I can't dismiss those experiences out of hand. And also just from the fact that I've read a lot of Leslie Kean's work on this subject, and the fact that the Times has willingly posted about it, and the fact that there are very legitimate high up people who say that there's like crash retrieval programs, and so I like, to me it's like there could be something more than meets the eye, but I'm just like, to me it's like the old Wittgenstein quote, that of which I do not know I cannot speak, right? So I don't know for certain, so I can't say for certain one way or another, and nor am I willing to speculate because I just don't know. So I'm willing to wait for people who know better than me to come out with this information.
Yeah, I don't think aliens have infiltrated our government. I don't
Yeah,
think that they need to. I The way that I think about our relationship with aliens, if there are any, is that they are observing us in the way that we may observe dolphins, and sometimes coming down and taking samples and seeing how the civilization is going, and much more mental capacity than we probably have, much more ability to bend the laws of physics than we do. And I don't know. I think the universe is huge, and life probably did develop much faster than than intelligent life developed here.
yeah,
And it just comes by and like, oh yeah, they're doing okay. Oh, they seem to be fighting. Oh, we don't need to like have some widespread takeover, because that would communicate that like there is any amount of equality between them and us, and it would be like us trying to fight dolphins. We're like, we took over your whole world in one day. Like it would be not a big deal to us. So
yeah,
that's kind of the way that I think about it, and I'm like, yeah, we peacefully coexist. Maybe we'll like understand that they're there at some point, but it doesn't affect my life that much. And I don't
Yeah.
have to like make it a reason that like something is happening to me.
Yeah, and this is why, I mean, I realize I'm probably in the minority here, but this is why I question the MO of the government. And this is what a lot of people always posit. It's like, well, we can't, this can't be public knowledge because then society would fall apart or whatever. And I guess
No.
like, but I'm just like, nah, I think people would be like, all right, that kind of makes sense, right? It's a big universe here. I just don't, I think that they don't give us enough credit. And then of course they posit, well, maybe the origin story of these aliens is frightening enough for us that it would cause society to break down. And again, I'm like, well, what, I've read some of the theories and some of the, what, people sort of posit as, and so there's all these sort of very ornate theories about how they're like. I think I read most recently there was a big Reddit LARP from someone claiming to be a molecular biologist who said that he studied these things and that they're sort of artificially generated and they seed life around the universe and we're just one of their pet projects. We're sort of like a chia pet for them, more or less, because if they make intelligent life, then it like and there's this other thing that a lot of conspiracy theorists love to do is they really for some and this is what I'm fascinated by is that conspiracy theorists need to draw a connection between the existence of aliens and spirituality and the afterlife.
Mm.
So those two things they need to link together and they're like part of the same universe, right? It's like people need to like get DC and the Marvel universe to like cross over. You know what I mean? Like,
That's funny.
yeah. And so I find that really fascinating. Like, why would something as genuinely worldly and secular, like worldly, no pun intended, but as like, the existence of alien life does not preclude the existence of the afterlife. Those are two completely separate conversations. But yet, anytime people talk about aliens, especially in a conspiracy theory context, they always bring up like psychics and spiritualism and the afterlife. And I'm like, why? What's with all the extra baggage you need to bring into this? So I find that's really interesting as well. But yeah, no, I mean,
Probably
yeah, go ahead.
probably we're looking out beyond the stars and we're like, well, out
Yeah.
there is where heaven is.
Yeah, 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 totally, totally. Aliens and angels, they come from the same place. Yeah, totally. There's probably something to that.
Yeah. Um the last, so this is a hard transition. The last conspiracy theory that I wanted to bring up because it's the one that I have the most difficulty maybe getting out of my mind is the conspiracy theories around 9/11.
Right.
And those came out when I was very young and I was exposed to a lot of like the conspiracy theories, like some of the earliest internet um like viral videos were about 9/11 conspiracy, and I was like all into it when I was younger and it was like a hyperfixation. And I'm not a particularly scientific person, so I don't have any way to falsify that. And then I would hear things come out like, "Oh, well, jet fuel actually does melt steel." And I was like, "Damn, okay. Well, there's increasing holes in this conspiracy theory." And I don't know, the initial documentary that came out about it, I was like, wow, this seems like pretty decided, pretty zipped up. And good conspiracy theories are like very good at doing that, I think.
Mm,
But for me, I still struggle with the fact that World Trade Center Building 7 collapsed, but it wasn't hit by anything.
yeah. I mean, I know enough engineers that, that question, if you actually spoke with an engineer about they unless they were already sort of signed up for the Bush did 9/11 theory, then they could probably give you a reasonable explanation for that. But my issue with that is like, so this is a really good example because this gets into my beef with conspiracy theories in general. So they take something that's legitimately worth talking about. So for example, Bush came into office with a very clear mandate to do something about Saddam Hussein, right? He
Hmm.
was not interested in international terrorism at the time, although that was like obviously going on because of. And I remember when 9/11, the morning it happened, and this is even before they speculate, I knew it was Osama bin Laden because I knew about the 1998 attack. And
Mm.
any reasonable person who knew anything about world politics, knew that this was almost certainly an Al Qaeda slash Osama bin Laden led terrorist attack. I knew that immediately. This was not like
Mhm.
something that came out in the news. Um, like if you just had to put 2 cents together and you could figure it out. But my issue is like you take something that's legitimately worth talking about, which in this case is that would George W. Bush want a pretense for an invasion of Iraq? Um,
Yes. Right.
yes. Would that precipitate something like ignoring credible terroristic threats as a
Right.
possible geopolitical opportunity to take advantage of that thing happening to, commit troops to invading Iraq? I think that's something worth talking about. Now, would I think Bush deliberately ignore something credible happening to the World Trade Center involving the death of 2,000 people? Probably not. Did I think it absolutely played in his favor? And do I think on the day that 9/11 happened, he probably had conversations with Dick Cheney et al. About taking advantage of this moment to focus on Iraq, which he did almost immediately after 9/11? And that's all on the record as being like, yes, you know what I mean? So it's not, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to say like, yes, it is absolutely plausible that 9/11 played into the hands of George W. Bush to concoct some reason to invade Iraq, which he eventually did 2 years later. That's absolutely true. But to go from there to say George Bush, less than a year in office, somehow coordinated a whole bunch of people going into the World Trade Center towers and planting explosives for a controlled demolition. Not only those two towers, but as you say, 7 World Trade Centers where as well. Despite the fact that pretty much everything that happened that day, you could explain based on the conventional events of that day. Not only that, like there are much easier ways to fake a terrorist attack than
Mm.
hijacking 2 commercial airlines to crash into the, two world. You know what I mean? Like it's again, it's like once you
It
actually
would
have to
be a
prove
huge, huge production.
huge
Yeah.
production, it would involve so many people who had with intimate knowledge of the event. People who by now, 20 years later, would have more than likely have come out with some sort of information about this. To me, it's like this is where you get into very sloppy, magical, lazy thinking about how the world works. You know what I mean? So I think this is again, it's a really good example of like you don't need a conspiracy theory to sort of get at what you're talking about. And so the conspiracy theory at this point is extraneous. It's like it's just an
Mm.
add-on that you don't actually need to talk about, but it's much less sexy and interesting to talk about the fact that you know George Bush was like a lot of Republicans saw zero difference between a terrorist group that came out of Egypt and eventually settled in the hills of Pakistan or whatever. It's like he saw no difference between them and like the very secular dictatorship in Iraq. But like tried to link that, you know what I mean? It's like we can have that conversation, but it's much more boring. Just there's a lot of footnotes and like you'd have to know a little bit about political science. And it's like this is my whole issue in general. It's like a lot of this stuff is made up for no discernible or good reason.
Mhm. And it's made up usually by someone, I don't know, who has a lot of sway, has a lot of charisma. And I'm so fascinated by like these theories have to come from one person usually, and then they get like added on to by other people in the chat group, in the Discord server. Um, I would be so curious to know what it's like to put that out there as someone, like to come up with these things and whether they actually believe that this has happened, because it's clearly just like pulling events like, okay, this event, okay, I'm going to stitch them together. And how often is that malice, and how often is it just like creative people who are pretty bored and happen to have a following? Um,
Yeah, like this is the fact. So this is the thing I was thinking. Should I mention at the top? This is the thing that I find tantalizing about conspiracy theories, but also like confounding. It's like I cannot like I often do these mental exercises, right? Like I try to be like, let's try to think like a right winger, right? Like let me think like someone who's right wing. Let me sort of pretend what it would be like to believe the things that a right winger believes, because I like to try to embody. like what it is to hold this and I find with
I love that.
conspiracy theories, well, you know, it's just like how I have to think this way because it's like how I keep myself in check, right? So and it's also like how I think about how to counter people, you know what I mean? And so I just have to think this way. And whenever I try to do it with conspiracy theories, I fail because
Mhm.
I ultimately don't know to what extent there's a bit of like natural storytelling going on and embellishment and what it and like it's like this thing happened. It's like the same instinct with a lot of pathological liars. They'll tell these really ornate uh like complicated lies that are just like castles in the sky. But they're doing it pathologically, which means that it's this weird in between space of like clearly they're doing it deliberately. Clearly they know to some extent what they're doing, but the only way it works for them psychologically is that they also believe what they're saying to some degree,
Mhm.
or maybe fully. You know what I mean? And this is the mindset that I cannot penetrate when it comes to conspiracy theories. Because when I try to think about this, do they earnestly believe this stuff? If they earnestly believed it, then they to me, it's like if you earnestly believe something, you would go out of your way to try to prove it empirically, right? And this great vaunted thing that a lot of conspiracy theorists love to tout, they say we are more scientifically knowledgeable than non-conspiracy thinkers because we care enough about this thing that we are willing to read academic papers that support our point, and so we and we question the scientific consensus, which means we will read through papers that the scientific community uses to hold up these beliefs and try to poke holes in them. You know what I mean? So we actually know the literature more than you, which is true to some extent. But
Mhm.
what they don't do is they don't actually follow the scientific methods that these papers adhere to at the same time, right? So they
It's
don't
all confirmation bias going on.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so they mistake the ideas like what a good scientist will do is they will look at the available evidence and they will come up with a hypothesis. But then they will go and they will do everything humanly possible to disprove the hypothesis. And they'll go over old papers and look at meta-analyses. They'll do new experiments. They'll up the ante on their experiments. So if they don't feel like one type of experiment is enough, they'll do a controlled RCT on it. You know what I mean? Like they'll just up the ante constantly until they'll be like, you know what? It's looking like this hypothesis is pretty much accurate. Now, I'm not naive. I know that doesn't happen in every single case, and I know there's some cases where there's incentive not to follow that rigorous model. But like the fact I work in a university environment, I know how universities work, and I know that like most academic researchers, they might get a grant once in a while from like a corporately funded philanthropic venture, but the vast majority of their funds are coming from university and research grants, and they don't give a shit. They're just scientists. A lot of the time they're associate or assistant or tenured profs, and they have nothing to gain by like selling out. You know what I mean? So and if they
They
did
don't
that,
have an
like one,
emotional they don't have
yeah,
an emotional
exactly.
connection with their results.
And if one person sells out, there are like everyone would have to sell out because the peer review process is such that you know what I mean? Like, and I'm not naive. Stuff falls through between the cracks here. Like, stuff gets messed up. There's a lot of bad scientific consensus that needs to be challenged in some areas, but at the same time, like, there's it's like a long distance from that all the way to conspiracy theory. So I've gone off track a little bit, but basically what I'm trying to say is like it's very difficult for me to think the same way or to try to imagine what it would be to believe in a conspiracy theory to the same passionate degree that people on TikTok, for example, subscribe to conspiracy theories, right? Like that woman on the airplane who like was having a panicky moment and who said, the person who next to me, I don't believe they're real, right?
Hmm.
And so like if you look at that video, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, by the way. Have you seen
Mm-mm, I
this?
do
Okay.
not.
So I don't know why she ended up in my feed a lot, but this woman, this is, and I swear, because I'm interested in this stuff. I think because I chase it a little bit, and then it comes back to me, and can just because I feel like your TikTok feed is like your id. It's like it's
Oh
like your
yeah.
it's like your dark
It's
underbelly showing back at
confirming all
you.
the things you believe and
Yeah.
also the things that you fight against that you
Yeah.
absolutely don't want to believe. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you see what you get. It's like you see what's going on in the nasty part of your mind or whatever.
Yes.
So anyway,
Yes.
she shows up on my feed all the time. So what happened was she was this woman before I think it was an American Airlines flight. And before it took off, she all the videos start after she starts talking. But essentially, what happens is you see her walk to the front of the plane. She's like, "I want to." She says to some, flight attendant, "I want to get the fuck off this plane. Like, I don't want to be here." And then at some point, she says something like, "The guy next to me is not real," and clearly she's freaked out and she wants off the plane. Now, when I first saw that, I thought, okay, maybe she's had too much to drink, but apparently that wasn't the case. But I thought maybe she's having, some sort of episode. Like I know a lot of bipolar people who've gone, they have very, or, they have manic episodes where a narrative is very, very true in their head and they believe the narrative and it causes them to do crazy. This happens all the time, right? There's documented cases of this happening. But even if that wasn't the case, there's like a whole number of things that you could think of um, that led up to this moment that don't involve an actual. So what most people on TikTok immediately jumped to the conclusion that she had sat next to a shapeshifter. This is legitimately all these videos being like, oh, it's a shapeshifter, and what is American Airlines going to do about the shapeshifter? And like the shapeshifter's eyes closed in this vertical way, as opposed to like it's a lizard person. You know what I mean? And it's like to jump from this video of this woman having a panic attack on an air flight to saying shapeshifters are real, discounting the fact that like there is almost zero video evidence of this ever happening in any other context, is so like part and parcel with the weirdness and the inscrutability and the unsympathetic nature of conspiracy theories to me. It's like, why? There's like so many
Mhm.
more obvious explanations for this than jump. You know what I mean? And it's clear there's
There
some sort of like anyway. Yeah.
there's a well-known disorder. I believe it's in the frontal lobe, where people will start to disbelieve that people are real. I actually want to look it up and just say
Yeah.
what it's called. Due
Um,
to the magic of editing, I can do this.
yeah. So while you do that, I will say that Tony, I think his name is Tony Donato. So he was a member of SCTV. So that's obviously the famous show with Catherine O'Hara and Eugene Levy and all these old great Canadian comedians. Um, uh, he had that condition, and he said his wife was not his wife. His wife was not the person she said she was. He didn't believe his brother, and he was unfortunately had to. I think he had to. He was committed to an institution, and he died there very tragically at a
Hmm.
younger age. So now I think this case is a little different because this person is a perfect stranger, and usually I think this happens with loved ones, right? But yeah, no, that's like a legitimate condition that people have.
Mm-hmm.
So
The
yeah.
internet says this is called solipsism.
Oh, well,
Individuals,
there's that
but I
too.
think there's something else. There's
No,
some
there's a legitimate.
disorder.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think Oliver Sacks wrote about it as well. It's like a legitimate thing where you, uh, for almost no reason whatsoever, believe that your loved one is an
Yeah.
imposter. Yeah, yeah,
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
I don't know what that's called, but
yeah.
yes, I have heard of that, and I'm sure that that's probably what was going on there. But yeah, that did
So I
not come
guess,
across my FYP.
my issue in general is like this kind of thinking where you would see something slightly out of the ordinary on social media or in the news, and this thing now where it seems like there's an arms race to like posit the most outrageous conspiracy theory based on those events. That is entirely new, and I feel like it's getting worse. And I hate to, it makes me sound like 1,000 years old because I'm worrying about this for the next generation. But it does seem to me to be a problem, and I don't have the knowledge to say with confidence what the cause is. Like I can speculate. Obviously, I think a lot of people would say, well, and I think you and I talked about this offline a little bit about the fact that we no longer have like it's no longer a universe in which there are four news networks and like three major national newspapers of import, and in fact most people don't even get their news that way. And so I think media literacy has completely like even like I think this ties really closely, and I've talked about this on TikTok before. This thing that really annoys me um, is when I'll watch a TikTok, say like it could be anything. Like usually it's like a plane crashing or some sort of major incident, right? Where a building catches on fire, and the comments will be like, very stupid. They'll be like, Like, I bet the pilot didn't see that coming, or like a few months ago, it would have been like worst best pilot in Ohio or something. But you'd have to scroll all the way down to actually find details on when this incident happened, who was involved, what caused it. And I feel like that, like, to me, that's the first thing I want to know. And I'm speaking as a former journalist, so I feel like part of that is like innate to who I am as a person. But I also feel like most people should think this way, right? Like, if you see something crazy on social media, wouldn't you want to know more about it? You know what I mean? Or true crime, that's a whole other thing when this happens. Well, you'll randomly
Mhm.
see a video of someone in a trial and they're being convicted, but there's no details whatsoever on what the crime was, the context of it, what they were actually convicted for, who this person is, nothing. And the comments on that post will be like immediately like, this person should rot in hell for what they did. We don't know what they did. You don't know who they are. You don't even know what this is from or what year it is. Like, and to me, it's like I feel like conspiracy theories are kind of tied to this, ultimately tied to this weird lack of curiosity that people now
Mm.
have about the world around them in some way, you know?
And a detachment from reality, an
Yeah.
essential detachment. The thing that we talked about offline, which I think is sort of like an overarching theme here, is there are no universally agreed upon facts, it
Yeah.
seems, anymore. And a lot of that is the lack of good education anymore, which makes me really sad. Um, you know, the people who grew up in my grandfather's time, my grandfather was born in 1945, they had news that they could watch and agree upon and have some solid set of like agreed upon things that people could, like, there was no debating the reality. You could debate opinions about the reality. And now, um because of the just absolute cesspool that is all of our information. Everything is presented alongside other information. There is no hierarchy of respectability in information really anymore. And there are good things about that. We've lost all specialty. We've lost all respect for like credentials. And essentially all the people born now, like of the younger generation, have just this inherent distrust in any fact that is presented to them. So where the older generation, there's a really interesting like offhand statistic I heard about sharing fake news on Facebook or on social media, that it had nothing to do with your political affiliation and it had everything to do with your age. So if you are more likely to share like Hillary Clinton bullshit or Trump bullshit, made up stuff if you're older. Um, and I think it's just like the older generation, like, oh my God, this is presented to me. So it has to be like a fact because it's part of the news.
Yeah.
And the younger generation, like there is everything has to be discounted. Nothing can be respected anymore. And I think that puts us in some really weird places. It can put us in some really weird places, and it's incredibly creative. Um, I was
Yeah.
like, isn't it so fun that they ended up at Shapeshifter? Like,
Yeah.
what kind of a world do we live in? Like, how, what, this is such a fairy tale like place that we live in. And it's
Well, it's
funny
just,
because
well, go ahead.
I actually hate fiction as a person. I don't deal well with like constructed realities. I don't know if like my trauma is like I just don't trust when people are making shit up. I live in the world of nonfiction and I love nonfiction. Yet I'm someone who's still a bit susceptible to like that stranger than reality. And I think I just kind of want it to exist. Like part of me is just like I kind of want to believe that some of the world is magical, that there are things that are going on that I don't know about. And ultimately, I think those that end up in a lot of conspiracy theories are just looking for control. They're looking
Yeah.
to control and find a unifying theory for their world that makes them feel comfortable.
Yeah, and this is the thing, like normally on, on some perspectives I can sort of imagine from their but this is the thing, like it feels that feels convincing to me as an explanation, but I truly don't know. Like sometimes I wonder, I question myself, is it about comfort? Is it about living in a world with simple explanations? Like that sounds right, but you know, honestly don't know. But just coming back to the education piece, like it's really interesting, right? Like one of the great cliches about a good education, and certainly university education, is that it teaches you critical thinking skills. And I remember every time I heard this, like my eyes would roll. Like it's just like it's this cliche that you hear constantly. But as I get older, I really do think that's kind of the separator at some point. And I don't know, I couldn't point to a specific moment when I learned like this is, but like I just go through life with this extremely vivid critical lens on everything that
Mm.
I hear and see, right? So um and this applies in different contexts. It's not the same lens to everything that I see or hear. And so to give you an example, like so if I watch a TikTok and it's two guys on a podcast and they're talking about like a woman in Canada who saw who they videoed like a deer. This is an actual thing, by the way. They put a videotape to see who's eating these deer that they leave out or whatever, and then they randomly see these two naked women show up and eat the deer, and they're like it's really spooky and weird, and immediately my brain's like, well, that's really interesting. I wonder what that's all about, and so immediately I go online to search about it, and I just know through how to Google and where to look. I immediately find a story that reveals that the whole thing is an elaborate hoax, right? And I do this constantly. I see a dumb TikTok where it's clearly two guys who have like, and to me, it's just like that's easy because I know that, um, if it's a ghost story or if it's something fantastical, it's almost certainly going to be fabricated. And if it isn't, there's probably a likely explanation for what it is. And maybe there's a rare instant where it's truly something that we can't explain. And that's tantalizing and cool to me. But just to eat it wholesale is just like, that's boring. That's boring. That means like there's just creepy stuff everywhere all the time and it's unremarkable. But to me, it's like, I need to peel the layers of the onion to get to the nub of something because only then is it truly interesting for me. But then a lot of people be like, when you sort of crap on conspiracy theories, they're like, "Well, do you believe everything the mainstream media says is true?" And I'm like, "No." And I also look at media stories with a critical lens, but the context is completely different because I know how media works. And so what I have to explain to people is like, the New York Times can't just print total bullshit in the paper. They will get sued, right? And there are people called libel lawyers who are on full time retainer by the biggest news media organizations for this very reason. And so reporters now, they know that anything that they report on is going to be highly scrutinized by fact checkers. And if it's a particularly sensitive story, that's going to be highly scrutinized by lawyers, right? So whatever they report has to be accurate. But what they choose to report on, that's where
Mhm.
bias creeps in, right? And this is
That's
what I have to
yes.
explain to people. So the idea that MSM, mainstream media is flat out lying to you is not true. What you actually have to pay attention to is what are they reporting on? What order are they reporting on? So who do they quote first? Who do they quote second? Who do they not
Mhm.
speak to at all, right? Because you
All
can
news constructs narrative. It has
exactly,
to.
right? And
Mhm.
so like me saying I don't believe in conspiracy theories does not also mean that I think that, the thinking behind a book like Manufacturing Consent is flawed. That is not true. But that's just another type of critical thinking that you need to have, right? And so this is the thing I find infuriating also about conspiracy theorists is like this very Manichaean black and white view of the world in which um, there are truth speakers and everyone else is a dirty liar who's in the pocket of corporate media, and only a few select apostles of the truth are the only ones we can listen to. Like this to me again is like a patently false but also boring worldview, right? Like
Mhm.
it's just like again it's like cops and robbers. It's just such a colorless way of looking at the world, that it's laughable to me, so again, this is the thing I have to constantly push back is like I am not a sheep because I don't believe your cockamamie conspiracy theory. I'm actually much less of a sheep than you because I've at some point in my life picked up the skill set to know what to look for to sort of try to poke holes in this or that story or whatever, so anyway.
This is gonna touch on a topic that I would love to expand on with you, but I'm just gonna lightly tap the topic right now, which is We have lost a lot of the outlets for identity in our lives. We've also lost a lot of the outlets for spirituality and ceremony and uh, life, not life transformations, rites of passage. There are no rites of passage anymore. And I think a lot of the issues that we see around conspiracy theories and like identity politics are actually stemming back to the fact that we don't have a lot of like church affiliation anymore. And like that's where we really could go before to be like, the world is magic and like a guy made the world and like there's all these this allegory and we get to like experience that. And the nerds that I know, like the people who are close to my heart, they do a lot of like fan fiction and like they live in the world of like um the Hunger Games and like all those there's like a needed outlet for that. There's also something that you brought up around um people not going to church anymore, people not having tradition. Oh, it was related to capitalism, so it's off topic, but it was like at church they used to teach everybody like you should do good for other people, like you should give, and we completely lost that. And because we're not giving, we're like in this really self-interested place that they were like, hey, just so you know, don't get too far into that place because people will revolt anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, so now, so a lot of people talk about what they call like lazy materialism, which is just sort of the default belief that, because physics has proven the existence of the atoms, that all we are is like material and there's no spiritual dimension, right? And to me it's like, well, that's just like we've evolved from what used to be lazy deism, right? So that
Mm-hmm.
there was a society in like the 30s, 40s, and 50s, more or less, roughly speaking, where it was still like there was still like mainline denominational Christian churches, and people went to the churches not necessarily because believed everything. In fact, a lot of times they
Yeah.
didn't really believe it, but it was just this general like place you went to because that's what the community did. And it was like
Yes.
society in general had this very sort of plain Jane belief that there was a God, that, probably Christian, maybe if you're in an American context, that, if you're a good person, you go to the good place. If you are a bad person, you go to the bad place. And that was sort of, and that was sort of you see it. You watch old black and white movies, there's like a general sense of the culture that, it wasn't this like fundamental, and I'm not talking about this like the current sort of right wing, revisionist history of the 1950s. That's not what I'm talking about. It was just a very lazy, soft
Yeah,
deism,
and it
right?
was just not that big of a deal.
Not that big of a deal. Not a lot of
Yeah,
like, yet. Well, there's a lot of anti-Semitism and racism and all these other things,
right.
obviously, but like generally, no one was getting into these big debates. Like, the hardcore atheists weren't screaming at each other yet. That was like a future problem or whatever. And then that sort of evolved over time, and then we got up to the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and then I think we got into what we call sort of lazy materialism. And so I speculate this often, is like, I think, one idea for why people are invested in conspiracy theories is because we no longer talk about metaphysics, right? Like, we don't talk about the inherent existence of meanings beyond,
Mhm.
beyond the material universe, right? And it's just, again, just show my cards that I'm not a hardcore atheist or materialist. Like, I think there are a lot of interesting things going on in consciousness studies that question the materialist basis of the universe, right? But all that aside, I think there is like a general hunger to look beyond the obvious sort of facet of our universe for something deeper, and maybe conspiracy theories are a way we can sort of do that. But again, I'm reticent to like throw all my cards into that pile, because I just can't get my head around what it's like to live in the conspiracy theory universe of like just believing in all these things. So I don't know, but maybe that's one explanation, right?
There's something that I wanted to say much earlier, and like, where does this come from? So I'll just put it in here. But I have known some really like I would say pathological liars, like people who really don't know the difference between when they're lying and when they're telling the truth. And the way that those people operate is just like all reality is subjective. And my truth is subjective. My truth changes based on what I need people to do. So it's a very like deliberate controlling, like control other people's reactions and their information. And those people, they don't do it out of malice. Usually the people that I've been close to, and I've been very close to some of them, they are deeply traumatized and they grew up in a situation where none of their actual needs were respected, and so they come from a place of manipulation at all costs. They don't have any true human relationships. All their human relationships are to force other people to do things, or like they don't believe they have any inherent worth. So their boundaries are completely they have no personal like boundaries, and they just believe that everybody is lying to everybody else, everybody is manipulating everybody else. And
Hmm.
I think that that's probably what's going on
That
with
is
some of.
super interesting. Sorry, I tried to interrupt you to just say this is fascinating to me and much more plausible than any other idea that I've heard thus far on this subject.
Yeah, and I think like you have these very charismatic, very traumatized people who have never had any self-esteem, who gain these followings, and they're like, um, now we must all live in the evangelism of our belief together. This is how I've created my community. And it's not that much different than a preacher creating community around how they interpret the Bible. It's a
Yeah.
very like similar evangelistic way of being. Um, I completely lost the other thing that I was going to say.
Well,
Um,
just to chime in while you remember, the reason I find this compelling is because I think I mentioned this earlier. Is that I find that conspiracy theorists are less interested in evangelizing their view of what's really going on, right? Because usually conspiracy theorists, their way in is to question the official record on something. That's what they are interested in talking about, right? So, like with the moon landing, they're much less interested in talking about why NASA. Like they'll mention it, they'll say, "Well, it's," but they'll mention it only in passing as a plausible motive, which is that the U.S. had to win the space race at all costs, and they had this 10-year limit and they couldn't do it. Like that's all after the fact. What they're really interested in talking about is poking holes in like the fact that the moon landing was filmed on a sound studio somewhere in Los Angeles or whatever. Um, uh, but I find your idea like I can actually plausibly think that someone who, as you say, is suffering from this kind of trauma, who literally does not believe anyone is telling them the truth because maybe they've been brought up in a situation where they rightfully had the instincts to question literally anything anyone was telling them about how the world worked. To me, that fits much more in line with how conspiracy theorists operate because, like I said, to me they're less interested in proving to you that
like the
they're
motive behind
yeah,
this.
or what the
Yeah.
actual thing is. They don't care about that. What they're much more wanting to do is to prove or to make you
How the
question,
lie is happening.
yeah, and or the
Right.
official story of something, right?
Right.
Because you have to again, it's like not obvious why someone would question whether the earth was curved or not. It's not obvious why someone would question if 9/11 was an inside job. It's not obvious. Like those things are, they don't point to an obvious conclusion. But that's not also what's most interesting to me or to conspiracy theorists about getting across. Like a lot of, and
I
that's the whole
think
thing about we're just asking questions here.
I think that this is probably how right wing stuff is operating. There's this leftist guy that comes up on my For You page, and he's like, I used to be like in the right wing camp, and here's how the process happened for me of becoming a leftist. And one of the things he says is like, you will not change their mind by giving them more information because they just believe that leftists are lying. They don't
Mm,
think that leftists believe any of this. They think that they're trying to manipulate everybody.
interesting.
And so when you come from that standpoint, basically everything is just a fight to gain power over the situation. It's not existing in any set of facts, or like everything is twisted around. But that was the essential thing that I brought from that, which is like they just think that leftists are making things up to manipulate, which I think is just projection, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I can see, we haven't even got into like whether or not it's fair to lump all conspiracy theorists in with like a particular political ideology. Although I do think there's like they're obviously very active on parts of the right, but there's interesting crossovers, right, with like wellness culture and things like that. But like I could see that with like something like vaccinations, right, and that's really to me that makes the perfect sense as like a nexus of conspiracy theory because not only does it involve government, it involves a government health agency, but it also involves something as intimate as like injecting something into your body and your children's body
Mhm.
and also being told you must do this, right? And so it's this like
Mhm.
confluence of things like bodily violation, the government saying it knows best for you, all these things. And again, this is why I find your theory about sort of the trauma, like, because if you're someone for whom government has like promised you things in the past and failed to
Yes.
deliver, if maybe you live in a red state where like you've seen devastation from natural disasters and nothing's been done, or you've struggled in poverty and no one's helped you for the longest time, and now the government wants to force you to take an injection for your own good and for the good of society, like to me of course you would naturally question that, right? So again, I find your thread, or at least that sort of reasoning, much more compelling than sort of some of the less interesting. And I'm saying to this to myself too because I've come up with very pat, simplistic explanations for conspiracy theories. But yeah, I think that
Notice
makes sense.
notice that the times in history that people are more stressed and people are not getting their needs met, we see this politics melding with identity and this sort of extremism. And then in the relative good times, you see sort of the, what did you call it? Lazy deism.
Yeah, yeah.
You see like more of a lazy, like what I see in my mind, like intuitively when you say lazy deism is of the 50s is like, yeah, most people are have their needs met, like they're not particularly stressed out, and so they can't really be swayed by like believe in this thing because they're like, eh, I kind of just want to go see a movie, And now, like, I feel we have much less. We're much less okay at this particular time. And it's not like the ultimate time that this has ever happened. This happens over and over again in history. We have crises, periods of crisis, we have periods of relative calm, and but notice when we are in crisis, when people are not getting their needs met, we see much more of like the need to believe in something really grand and big and aggressive even.
Hmm.
And I think the aggressiveness comes from us trying to solve our own anxiety, just like we live in a very very high anxiety time and we're looking for control, looking for ways to both understand and take action against things, which is the more scary thing about these online communities that develop and sometimes storm the Capitol.
Yeah. I mean, in a broader historical context, I think it's also important to probably point out, and I could be wrong on this, but I feel like human beings thinking conspiratorially is probably a much older practice than the sort of slight period we had of like scientific consensus in the 20th century. And if you think about the mid 20th century, because we're talking about the 30s, 40s, 50s, I mean, that it's funny, everyone looks to that period as like the sort of what we consider normal America, right? Like in terms of if
Mm-hmm.
you look at Republicans,
Yeah.
but it's such a unique and abnormal period in like history, at least in American history, and certainly probably in the Western world or whatever, because you just had, first of all, you had a very left-leaning president who won like three consecutive terms in the 1930s to deal with the Depression, and that was the president that took America into a war in which everyone pitched in
Yes.
in a nationalistic effort to help the Allied powers against the Nazis or whatever. So there was already this very like strong civic nationalistic fervor that existed in America, and so that went into the 1950s. And of course, beliefs in America at that time were very homogenous. So again, like this lazy deism we talked about. but also like mass media had just started, but it was very concentrated. So there were only a few networks and a few newspapers and a few trusted voices in media. So it's this very like artificial period in
Mhm.
history. And also, oh, and this was like also the advent of like public research in science. So like some of the greatest discoveries, technological and scientific discoveries in human history happened throughout, a little earlier, but into the 1950s and 60s. So it's a very sort of time capsule, very unique moment in human history. And then of course that eventually, over time has unraveled a lot since then for various reasons we don't get into now. But I think it's just interesting that I think keeping in mind, like if we look to then as like that was the sort of golden age of like where everyone was on the same page and no one was conspiratorial minded and people believed in government and corporate and income taxes were super high and like people believed in the power of government and that it could do good and there was the polio vaccine and that saved millions of lives. Like we look to this as normal, but in fact that is probably the most abnormal period that we could think of. And everything outside of that where we question everything the government does and we believe in like shapeshifters and that vaccines are filled with poisons that are going to turn on, what I mean, that's probably way more normal. And what's actually
Mhm.
happening now is we're reverting back to the sort of default mode of human existence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how interesting is it that both parties look to that time in different ways and say
Yeah.
how wonderful it was? Republicans ideologically, and leftists more economically, the high taxes, the giving away the vaccine for free, etc.
And you have
Yeah,
to
I
also
think
look
you're.
to whose voices were being repressed to make that period happen too, right? So like, the Roosevelt and the New Deal was very, there's a lot of racial bias in how that was implemented, and obviously like segregation was very much still on the books. So there's a lot of things that like, that we still even leftists see as benign about that period that it still involved a lot of regressive politics as well.
And I would make the argument that we had to have a lot of sameness in order to have unity at that time.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
though we experience a lot more turmoil today, we are allowed to own our individuality more. We're allowed to not agree with the group, which is, in a way, it sucks because we can't all agree on something and we can't make anything happen, which is also not great. But remember to have consensus, like, yeah, there's not a lot of individuality allowed, and we're always looking for a perfect balance between those things. um
So
and
I wonder if that. Well, go ahead.
of course we've started to talk about things that are loosely connected to conspiracy theories. But again, conspiracy theories are all rotating around this sort of identity politics and like understanding facts, which I would say like leftists are willing to engage with facts. And I don't see any part of the right that's willing to like have facts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering. I mean, so as I think about this more now, I'm wondering if maybe what because right now the way it works is like there's this sort of embattled scientific community that's like pleading constantly on social media, like, and they're
I know.
constantly battling with people questioning everything that they say or do, right? Like, so there's full-time accounts on Twitter of like people saying no, CERN isn't like opening alternate universes, it's not causing the Mandela effect. No, vaccines aren't like poison. No, like they spend literally more than half their time arguing against conspiracy theorists that that the way they think about the world is wrong. So maybe what needs to happen instead is like the scientific community and rational people at large need to maybe come to terms with the fact that we're actually just re-entering a period of human culture that is actually more the norm, and that we need to understand, well, how can we advance civilization or maintain scientific discourse in a world in which wild conspiratorial thinking is going to become the norm, right? Like maybe we just, as
Mhm.
opposed to this feeling that we need to just like whack-a-mole every single new conspiracy theory
Mhm.
that comes to light, we need to just accept this as like an inevitable cultural force that is going to exist in its own right, but continue to make progress anyway. Like so instead of thinking how do we create the perfect PSA or the perfect like information campaign to counter vaccine disinformation the next time there's um, public health crisis, maybe we need to discuss how do we do public health in a world where conspiracy theories are the norm, and not the exception.
Yeah.
And
I
that's a
think
whole
that's a
because yeah,
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. And they're probably not going to go anywhere. I don't think the internet is going anywhere.
no,
I don't think, yeah, our current crisis is going anywhere. And so, yeah, absolutely. How do we operate these things in a world where conspiracy theories can exist alongside it? I actually think when you try to counter something and say, no, it's real, or no, you're wrong, you energize an issue, which is why I never do that on TikTok. When I get people saying things like, I just don't respond because I think it lends credence to people who do that. So I don't know. If I was a scientist, I would just be like, this is my science. It's just
yeah.
existing here. Yeah.
I mean, because that's the 19th century model, right? Where, I mean, the 19th century is probably a great model for how we could move forward in many ways because science at that point was like the purview. It wasn't even necessarily like we always think of science and academia as like really closely knit together. But a lot of science was just like bored clergymen, doing stuff in their backyard with botany, right? Like that was the 19th century. And meanwhile, like there were all sorts of wackadoodle theories that we've
Mhm.
completely forgot about. Like most people believed in like spiritualism, right? Or
Mhm.
like or phrenology
People
or like
people were eating mercury.
yeah,
Those
exactly.
people died. Those people
Yeah.
died. So it worked out. It worked itself out.
Yeah, people thought it was a legitimate science to go, on the one hand you would talk about probably legitimate theories about how electrons and electricity worked, but on the other you would go to a séance that evening and think nothing of the fact that we could discuss what was going on in the afterlife legitimately, right? So
Right, right.
maybe what we need to do is to go back to the night. Like there's many reasons why we wouldn't want to, but just to maybe think about how science progressed in a century where there was no real mainline like consensus on what science was or even what the world was and explanations for how the world worked, right? Where there was a sort of plethora of voices on this side or the next thing. Unfortunately, I think the one area where we are going to suffer a lot is public health because that is
I was gonna
unfortunately the
say,
one. Yeah,
you
because that's
have
the
to
one
have cooperation.
exactly. The whole
Yep.
thing is based around the idea that it's like an all or nothing prospect, right? And what's really infuriating to me about vaccine stuff is like if you actually study, like I think I've said this before, anyone can do this. You can literally just go on the internet, go to Wikipedia, and just read how the vaccination process works. It's like the most boring bodily process you could imagine. It's something we do all the time. And in fact, like people who question like the artificial nature of vaccinations, they're actually it's just like taking advantage of one of the most naturalistic
Mm.
processes that we have, right?
Mhm.
Like the artifice of vaccines and traditional vaccines, there's almost no artifice because you're taking literally dead or inactivated virus and getting your body to recognize it, which is like the most natural process you could imagine. So it's just really frustrating to me that something that is so boring and like normal for human bodies has been like blown up into this thing where we're getting this poison into our bodies. Like it's really unfortunate, but yeah.
Maybe
That said,
it's
well, go
maybe
ahead.
it's that they tried to make science interesting. Maybe they tried to turn it into pop science and pop psychology and get clicks. Maybe that's the problem. Because
Yeah,
there's other stuff in our society that's just like, yeah, that's kind of boring. We're not really focused on it. It just exists, and I think science needs to go back to that.
maybe this is how I think this is like getting into the Freudian aspect of this. I think the idea of a needle going into an arm, of a
Mm,
fluid going literally visibly going into your body that you've been mandated to take by some sort of government agency. I just think that itself is the problem. If they could find a way to get you vaccinated by like, I don't know,
aerosol.
aerosol, uh, or even if they just put it in the water supply, like fluoride, like
Yeah.
then people could get filters for that, and the rest of us could just be like, you know what I mean? Like if they figured out a delivery system that wasn't so medical or medicine-y or
Can
something,
you
then
imagine the conspiracy theory backlash to "We've put it in the water supply, just wanted to let you know, you
yeah.
can buy this filter at Target if you don't want it." Yeah.
Or actually, this is what they should do. They should find a way to work with natural health or natural product people to sort of get, this is what they should have done. They should have marketed vaccines as like a natural health movement, right?
Yes, the same
Be-
way that quinine and, like, bleach solution or whatever came into
yeah,
the yes, exactly.
like, or what is it the silver that turns your skin blue or whatever, like that sort of thing, like
Colloidal silver,
colloidal silver,
yes.
that's the one, yeah. But something like that, because it is like, you can imagine, like, there's a guy, I don't know if you know this account. This is a great TikTok account of a guy who rebrands junk food products as if they were
Yes,
health
I love
products.
him.
Yeah, yeah, and
Yes.
it's so brilliant. Like, from a market, and
Yes.
you work in marketing, you
I
understand this.
work in marketing, that's
Yeah,
all that's ever happening
yeah, yeah,
in
yeah. So, like,
marketing.
exactly,
Yes.
and it's so brilliant and subtle, and I feel like you could see something for vaccines that's like very similar, harnessing your body's own adaptive power, like supercharging it, just like the way you take like powdered protein or whatever, like,
Yeah.
because it's very similar. It's very, very similar. It's a very similar idea. It's like taking something your body does naturally anyway to, like, you know what I mean? And a lot of, like, and you see this like with deep immune natural products and like immunity boosting essential oils. Like, it's like, to me, it's like a half step from that to
It
like
is.
something. So I feel like this is coming back to what I said earlier. This is what I think we need to be doing, as opposed to like pushing against the tide of disinformation. Is just like, how do we market this better? Like, how do
Yeah,
we how do we think
this
outside the
is a
box?
secret hack.
Yeah,
Yeah. We
exactly,
love
exactly. Like,
secret hacks that nobody else knows about because it
doctors
serves
don't
our
want you to know this.
individuality.
Yeah, doctors don't want you to
Yes.
know this one weird trick. Like, I don't know if I get this really annoying ad on TikTok now with this guy who's like figured out how to, stop migraine headaches, and he has this weird balloon thing coming out of his ear, and I'm like, I'm like, all right. And it literally says something like, doctors don't want you to know this. Like, you could imagine some underground, like, doctors don't want you to know this secret, like, anyway, just something like that. Because again, I think you're absolutely right. I think we just need to accept, it's like newspapers not accepting that, the digital revolution has already taken place and it's over, right? So I think maybe the public health world needs to like lay down its arms, because we're just living in a world where this stuff is going to be the norm for all time.
Yeah. It was so interesting to me that this pandemic had the aspect of I must do something that's going to protect you because most other diseases don't have that. Usually, you can protect your own self completely just by measures that you do for yourself. And this
Mm.
one had the particular aspect of other people having to wear a mask so that you were safe. And that was so interesting to me. I was like, oh yeah, there's no way we're gonna do that. And all, of course, all the early jokes during the pandemic of like, oh, what's going to happen if we have a pandemic? People are probably going to take all the measures to keep themselves safe and be really afraid that they're going to die. And the opposite happened. Just like people were like, oh, I'm fine. Um, and yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of people like, here's my id that come up on my TikTok is like people saying the pandemic isn't over. And I get a lot of that stuff. And I think
Yeah.
early on, I decided like people who are COVID conscious are probably more educated and smarter than I am. And probably I should be more COVID conscious. And so I tend to still respect people who are more COVID conscious. But it'd be really interesting to see how that history bears out. Um,
Well, the COVID thing is really interesting because, well, for a number of reasons. Like, first of all, it's kind of weird that we do talk about it like it's not a thing anymore. Like, I constantly see, like, during the pandemic times, as if it's all over, and I'm like,
mhm,
you know what the leading cause of children, like, in children death is now? It's COVID. Like, it's crazy.
mm.
Like, it's not. I think it's actually higher than, or second to cancer or something in leading cause of childhood deaths, which is like, and it's actually mild among children, right? So I think there's this like weird macabre thing where we've entered this phase of the pandemic where, yeah, a lot more people are dying, but we need to get on with their lives. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying, like, it's kind of strange that we've made this Faustian pact with each other not to question how we act as a society and this like crazy new disease around. That's one thing. The other thing I find really ironic about conspiracy theorists calling people who wear masks sheep is prior to COVID, the people wearing the masks in public were the ones who were calling everyone else a sheep because, it's like you don't understand. Like the government's not telling you it's way more dangerous. Like you know what I mean? We used to see people
Yeah.
wearing masks on the buses, kind of kooks, or like, what are you protecting yourself from? And it's like it feels like it's done a 180. So yeah, it's such an interesting thing. But I think any good historian would probably say, and I can't say this because I honestly don't know, but I'm sure that there's a relationship between a rise in conspiratorial thinking during pandemics, for
I think
various
that
reasons.
I think that we're likely to have waves of pandemic. There's just such an interesting like ripple pattern that I see, and this is more like my spiritual intuitive side where I see like 1918 and then further spaced out, and then I see the AIDS crisis, and then I see a little closer, and then I see COVID, and then I'm like, it's interesting, all these were attacking immune system recently to weaken people's immune system, and like then we had the monkeypox thing, and it was like, oh, monkeypox couldn't have been a thing unless people's immune systems were like quite weak because of COVID. And I'm like, I wonder if the next like novel flu variant is going to like affect us a lot more. So that remains to be seen. But I think that we will come up again, we'll hit our head against public health for a long time. And we'll probably experience similar to what we experienced uh, God forbid, during the Middle Ages when we didn't believe in any kind of like scientific measures and we were like, oh, it's all about astrology and, theory of, oh, you need garlic or just like all these stuff that didn't work. Probably we'll end up back there, which is really sad.
Yeah.
But again, the people who follow the scientific evidence will probably fare better. And probably that's how science will live on is, you know, the people who don't believe the right things will die. And that's actually how culture works biologically, is that it serves to allow us to survive more, and cultural aspects that make us survive less don't live on.
Yeah, I mean, just on the thing about the immune system, like it just reminded me. So a lot of people are like, well, these things, it's because of weak immunity that we're getting all these diseases. Like all the diseases that we know of are, related to our immune system. But it reminds me of like the problem of in World War II when, these scientists would study where the bullet holes were on the planes that landed and decided that's where they're going to put the armor because, statistically, this is where planes were shot down more often. And lo and behold, they didn't do anything because they didn't actually think for 2 seconds that they were looking at the planes that had survived being shot at, not the ones that actually crashed and burned, right? And so it's the same with diseases. The reason why we care about the diseases that attack the immune system is because they're the ones that are that last longer and are more deadly because they compromise the immune system, right? So,
Yes.
of course, that's where the correlation comes from. But if you like, this is the kind of if you don't know these things, and I think a lot of this is this is why I'm a big believer in teaching statistics and statistical science to kids way earlier than we do, and teaching it as like a unit that's not just in mathematics but actually blends into sociology because there's if you understand um, certain statistical concepts at a young enough age, it will completely change how you see the world and will give you like a superpower in terms of discerning things that are accurate from things that are misleading. You know what I mean? Anyway, that's a
Hmm.
whole. I could talk about that at
Whole
length.
other thing.
Yeah, whole other
Yeah.
thing.
Episode about statistics that two people will download.
Yeah, but in all seriousness, I do think like if you want we're talking about inoculations. If you want to inoculate yourself against conspiratorial or just like lazy thinking in general, I think reading a book like Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is a great start because it's just a great resource in terms of how to just go through your world and look at the information you're being fed and to give you a set of ways to question that information that will stick with you for the rest of your life and serve you incredibly well.
Right. Well, for all of those interested in asking good questions about the reality that they have accepted in their life and to not fall down the rabbit hole of like, conspiracy theories, get that book. And for all the people who are not interested in challenging their beliefs and who would like to stay in the same place, don't
Get a
download that.
TikTok
Like,
account.
get a TikTok account and
Yeah.
just see
Go nuts.
where your confirmation bias wants to go.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's been so nice talking to you today.
Yeah,
I
you too.
Yeah, I can't wait for more episodes. I had no idea we were going to talk about vaccines on this episode, but I think it's a really, oh, it's such a conspiracy theory area that I don't even think about because I don't subscribe to it. But I'm like, yeah, a lot of people have fallen
Well,
down that rabbit hole.
it's interestingly the one conspiracy theory that I can kind of understand. I actually can understand why people get icky about it,
Mm,
because again, I just feel like it's like the visceral nature of it. It's like going into your body, literally a fluid going into your physical body. And there's just something about that, you get to again talk about Freud, that it's just much more vivid than something like, I don't know, than believing 9/11 was an inside job. You know what I mean? Like that I understand more.
yeah,
Even though I 100% know that it's BS, but yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I never
Yeah,
know
thank
how to
you.
end. I never know
Yeah.
how to end the podcast, but this is the end.
Well, the way we used to do it on the score is we used to play ourselves out with music, and we would just fade off screaming at each other, making fun of each other. So,
Screaming at
yeah.
each other. That's
Yeah, yeah,
awesome.
yeah, it was great.
We got to come up with a fade out music. I don't know if I could
Totally.
ever scream at anybody. I don't know. My friend told me like I think you can scream, and I'm like I don't think I can either.
That is a good thing. It's a good thing.
Yeah, but anyway, until next time.
All right. Peace.
All right.